Chapter 1. A biting wind howled amidst the metal girders of the bridge, causing them to sing with a weird voice, and making Martin shudder violently. A sob escaped his tightly buttoned lips as he realized how ridiculous it was to worry about the cold in the circumstances. He stood on the concrete parapet on the wrong side of the girders, one arm wrapped tightly around a steel upright, as he gazed down to the gray waters of the wind-whipped river below. A river that would take his life. If the impact from the fall did not take him, then he would surely drown. If only he could summon the guts to just let go. He didn't know for sure how long he had stood there, but it must have been more than half an hour, maybe as much as an hour. He didn't care. Would it help to talk? Came a soft, gentle voice from just below and to his right. Martin started slightly and looked down to his side. A pretty, round face gazed up at him, her blonde hair curling out from under a brightly colored woolen hat. Her eyes were an unusual shade of blue and were filled with deep concern. Martin dimly registered how attractive she was, how appealing. When he did not respond, the girl started to climb the girders. "No!" Martin shouted. "Don't do that! Please, no," he shouted again as the girl hesitated, not looking at him, and then continued to climb. She stepped out onto the parapet and deftly sat down, her legs hanging over the edge. She leaned forward slightly and stared down to the river. Martin's breath hitched in his throat, and another sob escaped him. What are you doing?" he gasped. The girl looked up at him and smiled. "My name is Susie and I think I may be able to help you." Chapter 2. Martin just stared at her, and then closed his eyes and shook his head. This gave him a sudden shock of dizziness and he quickly opened them again. "Please go away," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere. Why don't you sit down? So we can talk." "I don't want to talk. I'm done with talking. It's too late. It's over. If you still feel the same after we've talked, I won't try and stop you. I promise." Susie smiled up at him and patted the parapet at her side. Martin couldn't believe what she was doing. What was she thinking? He decided she must be mad. He shook his head and looked away into the distance. "I nearly jumped once," Susie said, matter-of-factly. Martin ignored her and considered just stepping off the edge. "Right now. Just do it." "My life was shit," she continued. "But it's not shit now. I'm glad I didn't jump. Things were really bad. I couldn't see any way out. Jumping just seemed like such a good idea." "Please shut up," Martin replied. Susie went on, "I was a drug addict, living rough. I was attacked a few times and raped. I was beaten up and cut with a knife. It was bad." Martin looked down at her, frowning. "I really want to hear about you. Please, won't you tell me?" Susie asked. What harm could it do, Martin considered. Perhaps she would understand. He stole another look at her. "Either jump now, or talk and jump later," his inner voice said. He took a deep breath and then carefully lowered himself down until he could sit on the concrete edge. He was shivering violently, and tucked his hands under his arms. His teeth were chattering. 3 feet separated him from this slim young woman. Even if she wanted to, there was no way she could physically stop him from pushing off the edge and plunging to his death. He was still in control. Chapter 3. What can I call you?" Susie queried. Martin hesitated. He could call himself anything, but what difference did it make now? "Martin," he replied. "Well, Martin, my name is Susie and I'm a recovering would-be jumper." The girl laughed gaily, a dainty, musical sound, caught and carried away by the wind. Martin was stunned. How could she laugh about it? Again, it crossed his mind that she wasn't quite right in the head. So, she continued, what happened to make it come to this? Martin shook his head and did not respond. Lost your job, lost your wife, lost your home? Not difficult to guess, I suppose, Martin agreed. Although it was my girlfriend, we weren't yet married. Susie continued to look at him, waiting. Martin sighed. I was a teacher, he began. Lost my job. That's where it all started, a slippery slope. Made redundant? Susie asked. No, worse than that. I was accused of molesting one of my pupils. The silence stretched out between them. And did you? What? Martin was astounded at first, but this had been the problem all along. Everybody chose to think the worst of him. That's what made it so hard. He softened his tone. No, he replied, there was a storm, thunder and lightning. It was pouring with rain, freezing cold, and she was walking home. No coat, no umbrella, she was drenched. He paused. I gave her a lift home. She lived in my road. How could I not offer her a lift? She was in with the wrong crowd at school. My guess is they egged her on. She told her parents that I tried to kiss her. She was 11, for God's sake. As if I would shit. That was the beginning of the end. It was awful, you couldn't believe how bad it got. It didn't get to court, her word against mine. No evidence, of course, and she kept changing her story so it didn't stack up. But Mudsticks and the school weren't prepared to support me. I had to leave. Life became unbearable. The neighbors would cross the street to avoid me and my girlfriend, or shout abuse depending on their mood. Martin started to cry again. His tears felt like ice on his cheeks. One night, he sobbed, somebody soaked a bed sheet in petrol and stuffed it through the letter box and set light to it. I was out. My girlfriend died in the fire. Susie sighed and waited patiently for Martin to gather himself. He was on a roll and couldn't seem to stop himself. I started drinking. Fell out with my parents. Started sleeping on the streets. The police found DNA and are prosecuting the girl's father for manslaughter, but what's the point? My life is ruined, his life is ruined, and his family's life is ruined. What's the point? I got into a couple of fights when drunk. Pushed a guy a few nights ago. He fell, banged his head. He didn't get up. I ran away. He died. Sobered me up right quick, I can tell you, but it's too late, isn't it? I can't go back. There's no way back. Susie sighed again and said, you're right, your life is crap, you may as well end it all. Martin gave a snort of surprised laughter, astounded at her response. That's unbelievably helpful. You're a true professional. Susie turned and looked at him, her mouth turned up with wry amusement. She thought him attractive. It would be good to see him smile. She felt sure he would be quite gorgeous when he smiled. He was tall with broad shoulders, and she really liked tall men. Chapter 4. After I was raped, I became pregnant, Susie began without preamble. I was in a coma, not expected to recover. The baby was almost certainly at risk. My parents made the decision to have my baby aborted. Susie shrugged. Probably for the best, but I didn't see it that way when I regained consciousness. Ironically, I was clean by then, enforced cold turkey you might say, but that didn't stop the craving. My parents took me home, but I was climbing the walls. All I wanted was to get fixed up. They locked me in my room, but I eventually made it out of there. First thing I did was find the bastard who raped me. I knew him, you see, we'd been in the same squat for a while. Susie drew a breath, still gazing at Martin with those amazing blue eyes. I stabbed him in the throat. He just looked at me, choking on his own blood, holding his throat like that would help. He died at my feet and I did nothing to save him. I ended up here, she patted the concrete, on this very spot. But somebody helped me that night, and now it's my turn to help you. So you see, Marty, we are more alike than you thought, and I know I can help you get a new life. My life turned around. I am reconciled with my family, I have a loving husband, a great job, and I have never been so happy. You could be happy again too. Do you want to hear how I can help you, or do you still want to jump? Susie raised an eyebrow and waited. Martin didn't rush to respond. He thought long and hard, looking at Susie the whole time. Her gaze never wavered. She looked as though she would wait forever. Yeah, okay. I have nothing to lose, do I? No, Susie replied, but could we please get off this damned bridge and get a hot drink? Martin laughed and nodded his agreement. After you, he offered. No, you go first and then you can help me down, Susie replied. Chapter 6. Martin gingerly got to his feet and climbed down through the steel girders to the pavement. Despite himself, he let out a huge sigh of relief. Susie stood up and turned towards him. Martin held out his hand. Do you trust me, Martin? She said. Martin cocked his head to one side. Well, we've only just met, but I guess I trust you as much as I trust anyone. Susie crouched down and took his hand, earnestly holding his gaze as she spoke. Good, she said. You see, I've kind of tricked you, but I want you to believe that it's with the best of intentions. Martin frowned at her in surprise and opened his mouth to speak. No, listen, she went on. When things were really bad for me and I could see nothing worth living for, somebody helped me. Somebody right here, in this place. They gave me a gift, an unbelievable gift, a gift that changed my life. I am able to pass on that gift to you, and I intend to do just that, but first you must make me a promise. I can help you right now, but you need to promise that if you ever have the chance to help somebody who is at the end of their tether, and about to end their life, that you will help them too, just as I was helped, just as I am about to help you. Will you promise? What's this all? Martin began. Will you promise, Martin? She asked urgently. Well, yes, of course I promise. Why would I not? Susie pulled her hand from his and stood up. She continued to look straight at him as she deliberately fell back off the ledge. As Martin watched in horror, this beautiful woman changed before his eyes. She grew taller and broader, her hair shortened and turned darker, and she now wore a dark coat that flapped in the wind around her knees. And her eyes, her strikingly blue eyes, changed to chocolate brown, and Martin was looking at himself. As she fell, Martin thrust his arm further through the steel girders, impossibly but reflexively, trying to catch her. He screamed her name, but still she fell. She spoke, and although the wind carried her words away, he could read her lips, and knew she said, I'll be okay, and so will you. He shouted and reached for her, shocked to the core as she fell to her certain death. As she disappeared from his sight, Martin seemed to shrink in stature, his straightened arm became slim, the hand unbelievably elegant and dainty, his now long, fair hair whipped across his face, and his coat changed to pale blue, a color that matched her eyes. He heard a shout, the sound of running feet, and was suddenly aware of somebody at his side, but Martin couldn't tear his gaze away from where Susie had been. Somebody was screaming hysterically, and he slowly became aware of an arm around him, a hand on his shoulder. It's all right, love, there's nothing you could have done. You did all you could, but they were too far gone. There was nothing you could have said that would make any difference. Martin stopped screaming. He looked up into the face of a young policeman. He seemed very tall and his face was white from shock. The policeman looked down at the young woman in his care, her tear-streaked face framed by the blonde hair snaking out from under a woolly hat, looked into her amazingly blue eyes. Let's get you somewhere warm. What's your name, love? Mart, she hesitated. Susie, she replied in her soft feminine voice.